there was a wound. Before you had a name for it, before you had words at all, there was a wound, and something in you, something old and wise beyond its years, decided that the wound would not be allowed to simply bleed. It would be put to use. It would become an instrument. You would learn to read the weather in another person's face before they had spoken a single word, to feel the storm arriving in someone else's chest as though it were arriving in your own, to become so exquisitely, so painfully attuned to the suffering around you that you could move through a room and know, simply know, who was breaking and who was pretending not to be. This is not a gift you ask for. This is not a gift at all, in the way that word is usually meant. This is armor forged in fire, and for a long time it kept you alive. But hear me now, because this is the hour the fire comes for the armor itself. The role you built out of your suffering is dying, and its death will not look like peace. It will look like disintegration. It will look to everyone who has ever depended on you like betrayal. And I am here to tell you that this unsettling you feel, this vertigo, this sense that you are becoming someone your own mother would not recognize, is not the sickness. It is the cure arriving disguised as catastrophe. Let us begin where every true reckoning begins, in the dark, with the thing we do not wish to look at directly. The empath is not born whole. This is the first illusion we must shatter tonight, gently but completely. The world likes to speak of empathy as though it were a sunbeam, a natural talent, a soul simply more generous than others, more finely tuned to beauty and sorrow alike. But those of us who have walked the long corridor of the psyche know a different truth, a harder and more honest one. Most of the empaths I have encountered, in my consulting room, in my own reflection, in the dreams that visit the sleeping mind at 3 in the morning, were not born reading the emotions of others out of abundance. They were born reading the emotions of others out of necessity. A child in a house where the mother's mood determined whether the day was safe or dangerous learns, faster than she learns to walk, to read that mood before it fully arrives. A child in a house where the father's silence could turn to violence without warning learns to listen to silence itself, to parse its textures, to know which silence is merely tired and which silence is a held breath before the storm. This is not empathy in its purest form. This is surveillance. This is the nervous system turned outward in a desperate, unconscious bid for survival. Because if I can feel what you feel before you feel it, I can protect myself from what you might do. And so the child becomes exquisite at this art. She becomes the barometer of the household, the emotional thermostat, the one who softens her father's rage before it reaches her siblings, the one who absorbs her mother's despair so that her mother does not have to feel it alone. He becomes the peacekeeper, the fixer, the one who can walk into a tense room and through some alchemy no one taught him, make the tension bearable. And everyone around this child begins, without ever naming it, to depend on this gift. The family organizes itself around the child's sensitivity the way a boat organizes itself around its keel. Remove the keel, and the boat capsizes. And so the child grows into an adult who has never once, not for a single day, been permitted to ask, "But what do I feel? What do I need? Who am I when I am not reading the room?" This, I want to say to you plainly, is the birth of what we might call the wounded healer. Though I would ask you not to romanticize that phrase too quickly, because there is nothing romantic about a child who learned love as vigilance, who learned connection as the careful management of other people's pain. The wounded healer is not a noble archetype worn like a medal. It is a survival structure. It is brilliant, and it is tragic, and it is for a very long time absolutely necessary. I do not ask you to despise the child you were for building this. I ask you to understand what you built and why, so that you can finally see it clearly enough to let it go. Now, the persona. I have spoken of this before in other rooms to other listeners, and I will speak of it again here because it is the hinge on which everything I am about to tell you turns. The persona is the mask the psyche wears to meet the world. It is not false exactly. It is a genuine part of us, but it is partial. It is the self we present, the self that is socially useful, the self that gets us through the front door and into the good graces of others. For most people, the persona is a costume they put on in the morning and take off at night, more or less. But for the trauma-born empath, the persona is not a costume. It is a skin graft. It has fused to the flesh beneath it so completely that the person wearing it can no longer tell where the mask ends and the face begins. The role, the healer, the fixer, the one who always has room for one more person's pain, becomes not something the person does, but something the person is. And here is the tragedy hiding inside the gift. A role that becomes identity can no longer be questioned without the entire foundation of the self trembling. This is why, when the role finally begins to die, and it will, I promise you, it always eventually does, it does not feel like relief. It feels like annihilation. Let me tell you what I mean by the role dying, because I want to be precise here, not poetic for poetry's sake. There comes a moment, sometimes it arrives quietly, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, and sometimes it arrives with the force of collapse in a hospital bed, or a shattered marriage, or a breakdown that finally, mercifully, breaks something open. There comes a moment when the empath simply cannot do it anymore, cannot absorb one more person's grief, cannot perform the alchemy of turning someone else's chaos into calm, cannot smile through the exhaustion, cannot listen through the numbness, cannot give one more ounce of a substance that was never infinite to begin with, no matter how it was treated. And in that moment, Something ancient and long suppressed rises up from the depths of the psyche and says, in a voice that will not be argued with, "No more. This is not weakness. Hear me. This is the unconscious performing its oldest and most sacred function, the function of self-preservation, the function of individuation, the slow and often violent process by which a person becomes who they actually are, rather than who they were assigned to be by the accidents of their wounding. The shadow, that great storehouse of everything we were forbidden to feel, forbidden to want, forbidden to say, has been growing in the dark for years, decades even, swelling with every unexpressed need, every unspoken anger. Every moment the empath chose someone else's comfort over her own truth. And when the roll finally cracks, the shadow does not knock politely. It comes through the door like weather. Suddenly, the woman who never raised her voice finds herself shaking with a rage she cannot explain. Suddenly, the man who could always be reached, always be counted on, stops answering his phone for days at a time, and cannot say why, only that something in him has gone very quiet and very far away. Suddenly, the empath who built her entire identity on being needed begins, for the first time in her life, to need, and to need loudly, clumsily, in ways that frighten the people around her, because they have never seen this version of her before. They do not recognize this person. And here is the cruel and necessary truth I must give you now, without softening it. They are not supposed to. This is the part no one prepares you for. When the old role dies, the people who loved that role, and let us be honest, many of them loved the role more than they loved you, because the role was useful to them in ways that were never examined. Those people will experience your becoming as a kind of violence done to them. They will not say, "How wonderful, you are finally becoming whole." They will say, "What happened to you?" They will say, "You've changed," and they will not mean it as a compliment. They will say, "I don't know who you are anymore," and they will say it with grief in their voice, real grief, because in a very real sense, the person they knew has died. Not you, never you, not the deep and abiding self beneath all the masks, but the persona, the role, the mask they had come to depend on, as though it were the whole of you. That mask is dying, and any death, even a necessary one, even a liberating one, is still a death, and deaths are attended by mourning, and mourning is rarely graceful. You must understand, and I say this with as much tenderness as I can summon, because I know how frightening this is to hear. You must understand that becoming unsettling to others is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is very often a sign that you are, for the first time, doing something real. The psyche does not individuate quietly. It does not evolve in ways that are convenient for the people around it. Growth, true growth, the kind that reaches down into the roots of who we are and rearranges the architecture of the soul. This growth is disruptive by its very nature. because it requires the death of a structure that other people had built their expectations upon. You cannot dismantle a load-bearing wall without the house groaning. You cannot become whole without the people who loved your fragments feeling, at least for a while, as though something has been taken from them. And I want to say something else, something that may be difficult to hear, but which I believe, with the whole of my clinical and personal experience. The discomfort of others is not proof of your wrongness. It is proof of your movement. Stagnant water disturbs no one. A river carving a new path through stone disturbs everyone downstream who had built their lives around the old course. You are not obligated to apologize for becoming a river. Let us go deeper now, because I do not want to leave you with mere comfort. Comfort is cheap, and I have never trusted cheap things to hold the weight of a genuine life. I want to take you into the actual mechanics of what is happening within you, because understanding the architecture of your own transformation is one of the few genuine powers a human being can claim. The old role, the empath, the healer, the one who absorbs, this role was, in the language I have long used, a persona built directly on top of an unhealed wound, without the mediating presence of a fully developed self. Do you understand the distinction I am drawing? The self, as I mean it, is not the ego, not the personality, not the collection of habits and preferences you call me in casual conversation. The self is the totality, the center and circumference of the whole psyche, conscious and unconscious together, the archetype of wholeness toward which the entire process of a human life is, whether we know it or not, quietly oriented. Most people never encounter the self directly. They live their entire lives identified with the ego, with the persona, mistaking the mask for the face, the role for the reality. But the trauma-born empath has been given, however cruelly, however unfairly, an opportunity that many people never receive, because her persona was built so early and so urgently, because it was forged directly over an open wound, rather than grown organically out of a secure childhood. It is, in a strange and paradoxical way, more likely to crack. And in the cracking, light gets in. Or rather, to use the older and more honest image, in the cracking, the dark gets out, and only by meeting that dark, by walking directly into the shadow rather than around it, does the self finally have room to emerge. This is what is happening to you now, whether you have the language for it or not. The cracking you feel is not a malfunction. It is the beginning of an encounter, the most important encounter a human being can have. The encounter with the parts of yourself you exiled in order to survive. The anger you never let yourself feel because your household could not tolerate one more angry person. The need you never let yourself voice because your role was to meet the needs of others, not to have any of your own. The exhaustion you buried under a thousand acts of service because rest felt, somewhere in the deep architecture of your nervous system, like a betrayal of everyone who depended on you. All of it, all of it, has been waiting in the dark, patient as stone, for the moment the old role would finally grow too heavy to sustain. That moment has come, and what looks from the outside like a breakdown is in fact, from the inside, the opening of a door that has been sealed since childhood. I will not pretend to you that walking through that door is pleasant. It is not. The shadow, when it finally rises, does not rise in an orderly fashion. It rises like flood water, indiscriminate, overwhelming, soaking everything it touches. You may find yourself furious at people who do not deserve your fury, simply because they happen to be standing where the flood reaches first. You may find yourself withdrawing from relationships that were in fact good relationships because your nervous system, so long calibrated to give and give, no longer knows how to be in connection without collapsing into the old pattern, and so it chooses isolation as the only alternative it can conceive of. You may find yourself weeping over things that seem, on the surface, entirely disproportionate. A small kindness from a stranger, a piece of music, the particular slant of afternoon light through a window, because grief that has been damned for decades, does not care about proportion when it finally breaks through. All of this is part of the process. None of it means you are broken. It means the wound that built your entire personality is finally being allowed to speak after years, after a lifetime, perhaps, of being told implicitly by every role you were forced into that its voice was not welcome. Now, I want to speak directly to the fear I know is rising in some of you as you listen to this. The fear that if the old role dies, you will be left with nothing. That the empathy, the sensitivity, the deep attunement to others that has defined you your whole life will simply vanish, and you will become cold or selfish or unrecognizable in some permanent and frightening way. Let me address this fear with everything I have, because it is one of the great and unnecessary terrors that keeps people trapped in roles that are slowly killing them. The death of the role is not the death of the capacity. This distinction matters more than almost anything else I will say to you tonight. Your sensitivity, your genuine, extraordinary capacity to feel what others feel. This is not the same thing as the compulsive, trauma-driven performance of caretaking that you have mistaken for your whole identity. The role must die precisely so that the capacity can be reclaimed in a healthier form. Think of it this way: a plant that has been forced to grow in the shape of a trellis, twisted and bent around a structure that was never its own, does not lose its life force when the trellis is finally removed. It is disoriented, yes. For a while it may seem to sag, to lack direction, to not know how to hold itself upright without the structure it had grown so dependent on. But given time, and this is crucial, given time, it begins to find its own shape. Not the shape the trellis forced upon it, but the shape that was always latent within its own nature, waiting for the constraint to be removed. This is what will happen to your empathy. It will not disappear. It will be liberated from the compulsion that distorted it. You will still feel deeply. You will still sense the currents beneath other people's words, but you will no longer be enslaved by what you feel. You will be able to feel and choose rather than feel and perform. This is the difference between empathy as wound and empathy as gift, and it is a difference you can only discover by letting the old structure fall. I want to speak now about what the process of individuation actually demands of a person, because I do not believe in offering comfort without also offering honesty. And the honest truth is that this path is not for the faint of heart. It requires what I have called, in other contexts, a descent, a willingness to go down into the parts of yourself that the persona was specifically constructed to avoid. It requires sitting with feelings you have spent your entire life managing on behalf of others, but never once permitting in yourself. It requires tolerating the disapproval, even the outright hostility, of people who preferred the old, more convenient version of you. It requires, perhaps most difficult of all, a willingness to disappoint people, to let someone down, to be less available, to say the word no in a voice that does not tremble, when every fiber of your trained nervous system is screaming that saying no will result in catastrophe. It will not result in catastrophe. It will result, at worst, in someone's temporary discomfort, and at best, in the beginning of relationships built on your actual presence rather than on your performance of usefulness. There is a particular kind of loneliness that accompanies this transformation, and I do not want to pretend it away, because false comfort is its own kind of cruelty. When you begin to set down the role of the universal caretaker, some people will simply leave, not because they were villains, not because the connection was never real, but because the connection, as it existed, depended on a dynamic you are no longer willing to supply. This is a genuine loss, and it deserves genuine grief. And I would ask you not to rush past that grief in your eagerness to feel triumphant about your own growth. You are allowed to mourn the people who could only love the mask. You are allowed to mourn the version of yourself who believed that being endlessly available was the price of belonging. Grieve it fully. Grief that is honored moves through us. Grief that is denied calcifies into bitterness, and bitterness has no place in the life you are building now. But I also want to tell you, and this is not a promise made lightly, this is something I have witnessed again and again in the long and often difficult work of watching human beings become themselves, that the people who remain, or the people who arrive new into your life after this transformation, will know you in a way the old relationships never could, because they will not be relating to a performance. they will be relating to a person, and there is no substitute, none, for being loved as you actually are rather than as you have learned to present yourself. This is worth the loneliness of the transition. I say this not as a platitude but as a hard-won conviction. It is worth it. Let me speak now of something I consider essential and which is too often left out of conversations about healing. The difference between destruction and transformation, and how easily, in the depths of this process, one can be mistaken for the other. When the old role begins to die, there will be moments when you feel as though you are simply falling apart with no coherent self waiting on the other side to catch you. This feeling is real, and it is also, I want to gently insist, incomplete. The psyche does not tolerate a true void for long. Beneath the collapsing structure of the old persona, something is already forming, has in fact been forming all along, in the depths, in your dreams, in the strange symbols and images that have been trying to get your attention for years, perhaps in ways you dismissed as random or irrelevant. The self does not wait passively for the ego to finish its collapse before beginning its work. It has been working the entire time, weaving the threads of a more authentic identity, even while the old one was still standing, still performing, still exhausting itself in service of a role that was never sustainable. This is why I ask you, in this period of unsettling transformation, to pay closer attention than you ever have to your inner life, to your dreams, yes, but also to the sudden images that arrive unbidden, the songs that will not leave your mind, the strange pull you feel towards certain colors, certain landscapes, certain kinds of solitude you never used to crave. These are not distractions from the work. They are the work. They are the unconscious sending up flares, showing you fragments of the person you are becoming, long before your conscious mind has the vocabulary to describe her. Trust these fragments. Write them down. Do not dismiss them as nonsense, simply because they do not fit the tidy narrative of who you were trained to be. I want to say something now about anger, because I have noticed, across many years of this work, that anger is the emotion the trauma-born empath fears most, and therefore the emotion most likely to erupt with the greatest force when the old role finally cracks. You were, I would guess, taught very early that your anger was dangerous, dangerous to the fragile peace of your household, dangerous to the people whose moods you were tasked with managing, dangerous perhaps to your very safety. And so you learn to metabolize your anger into something more palatable, into worry, into overfunctioning, into an anxious hyper-attentiveness that looked, from the outside, like devotion, but which was, underneath, a highly sophisticated form of fear. When the role dies, that buried anger does not simply evaporate. It rises. And I want to tell you plainly, let it rise. Do not perform your anger for an audience, and do not use it as a weapon against people who do not deserve it. This is not what I am counseling. But do not, I beg you, suppress it back into the silence from which it came, simply because its arrival is inconvenient, or unfamiliar, or frightening to those around you. Your anger, properly metabolized, is not your enemy. It is information. It tells you, with a clarity nothing else can provide, exactly where your boundaries were violated, exactly where your needs were ignored, exactly where the old role demanded a self-erasure you were never meant to sustain forever. Listen to it. Let it teach you where the walls of your new life need to be built. I want, too, to speak of the body, because the mind alone will not carry you through this transformation. The body has its own memory, its own wisdom, its own way of processing what the conscious mind is still too frightened to face directly. The trauma-born empath often lives disconnected from her own body, because the body was, for so long, simply an instrument for reading other people's states rather than a home for her own. You may find, in this period of transformation, that old physical symptoms arise. Tension in places you had forgotten could hold tension, exhaustion that sleep does not touch, a restlessness in the limbs that has nothing to do with any external circumstance. Do not be alarmed by this. The body is not malfunctioning. The body is finally being permitted to speak a language it has been forbidden from using for years. Move it. Walk it through forests if you can find them, or through streets if you cannot. Let it shake, if shaking is what it needs to do. The body knows how to discharge what the mind alone cannot process, and this transformation, like every true transformation, must be lived through flesh and bone, not merely thought about from a comfortable distance. Now I want to turn towards something larger, something that reaches beyond your individual story into the shape of the collective world we all inhabit, because I do not believe your transformation is happening in isolation, however lonely it may feel. We live in an age, and I suspect every age has said something similar of itself, but I believe it is nonetheless true of ours, that rewards the performance of endless availability. The culture around you has trained an entire generation of sensitive people to believe that their worth is measured by how much of themselves they can give away before they collapse. It has confused exhaustion with virtue, self-erasure with love, boundarylessness with connection. When you begin to dismantle the old role, you are not simply healing a private wound. You are, in a small but real way, refusing to participate in a collective pattern that has consumed countless people before you and will consume countless more if it is not interrupted somewhere by someone in some ordinary life. Your transformation, unsettling as it feels from the inside, is a form of quiet rebellion against a world that has too often mistaken the depletion of sensitive people for the natural order of things. You are not only saving yourself, you are demonstrating, by the simple fact of your survival and your becoming, that another way of living is possible. I want to be honest with you about the timeline of this process because I have seen too many people grow discouraged by expecting transformation to arrive on the schedule of a single dramatic turning point, when in truth it unfolds more like a season changing, imperceptibly at first, and then quite suddenly, undeniably. There is no single day on which you will wake up and find the old role fully dead and the new self fully formed. There will be relapses. There will be days when the old pattern reasserts itself with startling force, when you find yourself once again absorbing someone else's pain as though it were your sacred duty, once again silencing your own needs to keep the peace, once again performing the caretaker even as some deeper part of you screams in protest. Do not mistake these relapses for failure. They are simply evidence that old patterns, especially patterns forged in childhood, in the earliest and most impressionable years of the nervous system's formation, do not release their grip all at once. They release it in layers, in cycles, each time a little more, each time revealing a little more of the ground beneath. Be patient with yourself in a way that perhaps no one was patient with the child who first built this role out of necessity. That patience, extended finally to yourself, is itself a form of the healing you have been seeking all along. There is a particular image I want to leave with you because I have always believed that images carry what mere argument cannot. Picture, if you will, an old and ornate house, a house you did not build by choice, but which you inherited, in a sense, from the circumstances of your early life. This house has many rooms, and one room in particular has been used, for as long as you can remember, as a kind of workshop where you labor endlessly on behalf of everyone who visits, repairing their broken things, absorbing their weather, making yourself smaller so that their larger needs can be accommodated. You have lived almost your entire life in that one room, believing it to be the whole of the house, believing that your worth as an inhabitant depended entirely on how tirelessly you worked within its walls. But the house is larger than that room. It has always been larger. There are other chambers you have never entered, rooms full of your own unclaimed desires, your own unspoken grief, your own capacity for rest and pleasure and creativity that has nothing whatsoever to do with being useful to another soul. The death of the old role is nothing more and nothing less than the moment you finally step out of the workshop and begin tentatively, fearfully, to explore the rest of the house that has been yours all along. Yes, the people who only ever knew you in that workshop will be confused when you are no longer there to greet them. They may knock and wonder where you have gone. Some of them will follow you deeper into the house, curious, willing to know you in your fuller dimensions. Others will simply wait at the workshop door, unwilling or unable to seek you elsewhere, and eventually they will drift away, back to whatever other workshops they can find, other people willing to labor endlessly on their behalf. Let them go with as much grace as you can manage. Their departure is not a verdict on your worth. It is simply the natural consequence of no longer offering the specific service around which the old relationship was built. I want to speak now, as I draw toward the close of what I have to say to you, about the particular courage this transformation requires, because I do not want you to mistake gentleness of tone for gentleness of task. What I am describing to you is not a soft process. It is one of the most demanding undertakings a human being can face, precisely because it requires you to tolerate being misunderstood by people whose good opinion you have spent your entire life working to secure. It requires you to sit inside the discomfort of your own transformation without rushing to explain yourself, without performing your growth for an audience, without seeking permission from the very people whose expectations built the cage you are now dismantling. This is lonely work. It is also, I promise you, the only work that leads anywhere real. Consider for a moment what it would mean to live the rest of your life inside the old role, to continue absorbing, continue performing, continue managing the emotional weather of everyone around you, while your own inner world grows more and more silent, more and more starved, until one day there is simply nothing left to give, and you collapse not into transformation, but into a kind of living death, a person who has entirely disappeared into the service of others, and can no longer locate herself anywhere within the wreckage. I have seen this ending. I have sat with people at the far edge of it, and I can tell you, without exaggeration, that it is a far greater tragedy than the temporary unsettling you are living through now. The discomfort of becoming is difficult. The stagnation of never becoming is fatal in every sense but the merely biological. So I ask you, standing here at the threshold of your own dismantling, to choose the harder and more honest path. Let the role die. Let it die fully, without clinging to its corpse, out of fear of what will be left in its absence. Trust, and I know trust is a difficult thing to summon when everything familiar is falling away. Trust that, beneath the wreckage of the old identity, something more essential has been quietly waiting, has in fact been waiting your entire life, patient beyond your capacity to imagine, for the moment you would finally have the courage, or simply the exhaustion, to let the old structure fall, so that it could finally step forward and be seen. This is not a metaphorical hope I am offering you. This is a description of a process I have witnessed in the lives of countless people who once stood exactly where you now stand, frightened, disoriented, mourning a self they no longer recognized, wondering if they would ever feel solid ground beneath them again. And I can tell you, with the full weight of everything I have witnessed, that solid ground does return. not the same ground as before. You will never again be able to stand on the old, false foundation of endless self-sacrifice, but a new ground, more honest, more sustainable, built not on the performance of caretaking, but on the genuine, freely chosen presence of a person who has finally met herself. You are not becoming someone unrecognizable in order to lose yourself. You are becoming unrecognizable to those who only ever knew your mask, precisely because you are, at long last, becoming recognizable to yourself. There is no greater work available to a human being than this. There is no more important transformation than the slow, difficult, unsettling process of shedding a role that was built to survive a wound, in order to finally live as the whole person that wound was never able to fully suppress. Let the old role die. Let it die loudly if it must, quietly if it can, but let it die completely, without apology, without the exhausting labor of managing everyone else's grief over its passing. On the other side of that death is not emptiness. On the other side of that death is the first true encounter you will have ever had with your own face, unmediated by the performance of usefulness, unclouded by the fear that governed you since childhood. That face has been waiting a very long time to be seen. It is time, finally, to let it look back at you, and to recognize, perhaps for the first time in your life, that what you are looking at is not a stranger at all. It is simply you, whole, unguarded, and for the very first time entirely your own.